You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war.
The American military were also experimenting with LSD as a potential weapon.
Here is a group of normal soldiers responding correctly to a series of routine drill commands. After receiving a small dose of LSD, they're confused and undisciplined.
In the 1960s, the US and British military tried to weaponize LSD. Not only did they try giving it to soldiers in the field, but they also dosed unsuspecting civilians with it, along with other psychedelics, in their search for a so-called truth serum, which is really just a euphemism for torture drug. Unfortunately for the military, it wasn't feasible to spray LSD from airplanes onto enemy troops, nor were psychedelics good at extracting confessions during interrogations. But many people do believe LSD was intentionally injected into the anti-war movement during the 1960s by the CIA in order to disrupt it. Tune in, turn on, and always drop out, said Timothy Leary, angering many in the movement and leaving some of the more capricious conspiracy theorists wondering to this day whether Leary was on the CIA payroll. While I'm leery of that Leary theory, I wouldn't rule out completely the notion that the CIA had a hand in distributing LSD through the anti-war movement. We know, for example, that they helped spread crack cocaine into black communities in the 80s, in part to fund their secret Contra war in Nicaragua, but also to disrupt those communities, which has led to a massive prison industrial complex. So it's certainly possible that 20 years earlier, during a time of far greater political upheaval, the CIA tried to weaponize LSD to disrupt and pacify what they viewed as the domestic enemy. But we'll leave that question aside. More importantly for this episode, I want to discuss whether psychedelic drugs, and in particular MDMA, have generalizable effects on the political consciousness of individuals who consume them. What effect did LSD have on the individuals in the anti-war movement during the 60s, regardless of any potential CIA intentions? Did it make young people more anti-war? It was certainly a big part of the anti-war culture. Did it make them passive? Are there any inherent effects of LSD on consciousness, or is it simply, as some people say, a non-specific psychic amplifier? Studies show that people who have used LSD generally score higher in the personality trait of openness. Could there be causation here? Or is it just that people willing to break the law to use an illegal drug of any kind are already more open? And what about MDMA? We know that in conjunction with therapy, MDMA can heal PTSD, and certainly that's positive. But does it generally make people more open, more tolerant? Again, MDMA users score higher in studies assessing openness and empathy. But is this causation or correlation? Or how about this? Will MDMA therapy for veterans allow them to go back out onto the battlefield and kill more brown people in the service of empire? These are not rhetorical questions. People are really asking them. Social media is spinning these days with debates over whether MAPS focus on veterans in their PTSD studies or their acceptance of a $1 million donation from the ultra-conservative Mercer Foundation is going to result in more war and more intolerance. Haunted by fears of secret military programs to create MDMA-recharged soldiers better able to kill and maim, some people are now even questioning the entire MAPS agenda of, quote, mainstreaming psychedelics. I think these questions are worth asking, and in this episode we speak with someone who's not only asking them, but asking everyone them. David Nickles, not to be confused with the former Purdue University professor and psychedelic chemist with the same name, has been ruffling a lot of feathers lately with questions and criticisms of what he views as the willingness of the psychedelic community to partner with the most destructive forces within society, to, as it were, dance with the devil. I have to say this interview was hard for me. There were times when I felt David was being contentious and argumentative just for its own sake, and I started questioning his sincerity. By the end, though, I really came to like the guy, and I realized he was being honest, 100%. And as an outspoken, self-described radical, we have a lot in common. And despite our still major disagreements, we did end up finding those places. It just took a little while. And whether you agree with his critique or not, or whether you find yourself reeling, like Tatiana did, from his combative approach to conversation, nonetheless, the issues we talk about and the depth we go into them are fascinating. And the interview, I can guarantee you, is unlike anything you've ever heard before. Just please fasten your seatbelts first. Now let's talk with Tatiana. Tatiana, I'm really glad to see you working on your paintings and drawings all the time.
Yeah, it's great for me. I'm loving it, except my arm gets a little sore, so then I have to use my left hand.
The dot drawings that you're doing are really incredible. I'm so excited to eventually show them to people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your support. It's really sweet. I appreciate your encouragement and your help with organizing. You're a great manager.
Yeah, we're gonna make prints of your drawings available as soon as possible.
So I've been doing these stipple drawings, pointillism, with pens, and I draw on top of coffee spills. So that's fun because the liquid creates a lot of organic, natural shapes, and then I just play with that with my psychedelic impressionism.
They're really great. I wish we could show it to you now. You know, maybe I'll take a photo of a cross-section of it and put it up on the page for this episode so people can see what we mean by coffee spill stippling.
Yeah, work in progress is fun to see. Yeah.
Great.
So it's a big day for MDMA the movie.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I've released my first short documentary on YouTube called Dead Dog on the Left. And it's the long-form version of the veteran story from my upcoming documentary, MDMA the Movie. It's on YouTube. I'm submitting it to film festivals now. Also, 26 minutes long.
So there's material in this short film that goes above and beyond what's going to be included in the main movie when that comes out.
Absolutely. MDMA the Movie is going to have so much more. It's a comprehensive film about MDMA, harm reduction, drug policy reform, and the therapy section is only a small part of MDMA the Movie, and the veterans part of the therapy section is an even smaller part. We may have about 7 minutes of the veteran story in MDMA the Movie, but we spent 100 hours following Nigel and Tyler around during their process, and so this is the full-length mini documentary. Dead Dog on the Left follows two veterans attempting to heal from their PTSD. Nigel McQuarrie, who was an early participant in the MAPS FDA studies using MDMA to treat PTSD, and he tries to get his friend and battle buddy who he served with in Iraq, Tyler Flanagan, into the study. But he couldn't get in. And so Nigel finds an underground therapist for Tyler to go to. And Tyler agrees, and we film the entire process. We film Nigel going down to Florida to convince Tyler to undergo the therapy illegally. We film Tyler talking with his friends and family about it. We interview Tyler before and after his therapy. And nothing like this has been put on film before. There have been a lot of interviews with veterans and others after their therapy, but this is the first time audiences are going to get to see the transformation of someone with severe PTSD undergoing MDMA therapy and coming out the other side healed. And hopefully we'll be showing it live at some film festivals around the country.
Yeah, the material and the filming was a significant event in our lives and in the lives of these vets. Tyler, the vet who goes through this underground therapy, and we follow him in the movie, he has become a good friend of our family. You know, we've been in touch with him as he's continued on his healing journey.
He's doing really well now, by the way.
And his friend Nigel, who was able to participate in the MAPS study, has become a really powerful advocate for MDMA therapy and is really doing amazing work in the world, speaking and, you know, working with us on this movie. We're very grateful to him for becoming a part of our lives. And I just really admire the fact that Nigel has taken his own personal healing experience and turned that into a campaign to help heal others and the world and society. I mean, this is a wonderful example of how one person's experience with healing can become an activist campaign. And that's going to come up in our topic today as well. Is the healing of an individual significant on a cultural level or a systemic level? And Nigel's just a great example of someone who has taken the lesson that he's learned in his own life and understood how that can help others.
Isn't that how it always works, though? You know, it's unfortunate that sometimes it takes tragedy to turn people into activists, but also positive transformation can often turn people into activists. And that's, you know, what we're seeing here with Nigel. And also myself. My advocacy came from my personal transformation as a teenager, too, when I first took MDMA for therapeutic purposes back in 1986. And it changed my life. And that's what ultimately led me to found DanceSafe. So, Tatiana, why don't you tell people about our troll?
Yeah, we got a troll, you guys. Our episode Rolling with Noriega mentioned the Osho cult.
Right.
From Wild Wild Country fame. And apparently a member of the cult, I guess.
I think it'd be former member now.
Yeah.
Or just an Osho devotee.
Yeah, he just saw the post. He clearly didn't listen to it and started running around all over the internet giving us 1-star ratings and accusing us of persecuting religious minorities.
Yeah. So he rated our Facebook page with 1 star and made this comment. I'll read it to you. Barely off the ground and already capitalizing on public dislike of a religious minority to get points.
Okay.
And I was totally bewildered. I'm like, what? What is this guy referring to? I had no idea. So I actually write back. You can see this on the Drug Positive Facebook page in the review section. I write back, hey there, what are you referring to about capitalizing on a public dislike of a religious minority? And I let him know, I've got a master's degree in religion and I respect all faiths. And then he responds to that in this snarky way. Congratulations, that doesn't change your bigotry or mischaracterization of followers of Osho. I have a doctorate in psychology and a master's in rhetorical studies if we're playing education cards, and I can observe personality traits over apparently unused degrees. I highly doubt your coverage of Bhagwan is just out of nowhere. You are hopping on the train started by Wild Wild Country because it's now fashionable to make fun of the group. I strongly dislike your podcast.
Wow. He has you figured out. He can observe all your personality traits. I'd like to say that actually you didn't even mention Bhagwan. It was one sentence that your guest...
Yeah, let's be clear here. It was Torsten Passy, an MDMA historian, who just simply says that followers of the Osho commune brought MDMA to Ibiza, where the British DJs learned about it and brought it back to Britain, which launched the rave culture.
Yeah.
So I respond back to him, Andrew, where have we said anything disparaging of Osho? In fact, we appreciate his commune dispersing MDMA across the globe. Whether intentional or not, that's a great service to humanity. Did you listen to the podcast? Seriously, I think you may have jumped to conclusions here. Have a listen. Osho's followers played an important role in spreading this vital medicine around the globe. We are thankful to them for that. And he never responds after that.
Yeah. So just bringing this up to make the point that the topics that we cover, that was surprising, but generally, drugs will sometimes trigger people and sometimes people will react irrationally.
You know what I think it was? I think he may have been anti-drugs.
Yeah, exactly.
And so just the association, even though we think it's positive because we think MDMA is a great medicine and is helping humanity and it shouldn't be illegal, he just sees it as disparaging the commune and Osho because that happened. And he wasn't willing to go beyond that, even when I told him.
He doesn't even know what our podcast is about because we're pro-drugs. And he's probably assuming that we're anti-drugs because society is so anti-drugs. But I'm just trying to say that we need some 5-star reviews now.
Oh, yeah, that's right, everyone. You should go not just to our Facebook page and give us a nice review. That's not even as important. You should go to iTunes and give us a review. Look, we watch the stats stats, we know that more than half of you listening now are listening on iTunes. So please write a review for us. Give us a 5-star review. You want to help end the drug war, right? You want to get this message out there. The more positive reviews we have, the more iTunes promotes us to other people.
And Stitcher also. The guy did leave a 1-star on Stitcher. So wherever you're listening, go and give us a bunch of stars and some good review.
Thank you.
So some of our content can trigger people. Even just talking about drugs can cause strong reactions in people and some of the other stuff we bring up.
Well, I have to say I was a bit surprised by some of the flack we got from our last episode where we criticized the media's response to Elon Musk pretending to smoke weed on the Joe Rogan show. And I think it might have been because there's a lot of Elon Musk fans out there, and we're not big fans of Elon Musk, and we don't really need to get into why, but really on the show what we were pointing out was that the conservative media was criticizing him for smoking weed, and then the liberal media, of course, in response was just blanket defending him for smoking weed on the podcast, when the truth was he didn't smoke weed on the podcast. And we were just pointing out that nonsense. That's all it really was. But some people really took offense.
Basically, we just wanted to point out that the media was making a really big deal out of nothing. Drug Nonsense is a media criticism show, and we were criticizing the media on both sides. And so we wanted to share that episode with you to give you an example of what we're going to be offering on our Patreon. So that's why we had something different last week. Drug Nonsense.
Yeah, last week was a special episode. It was actually a free episode of our Patreon.com subscriber podcast, Drug Nonsense, where we critique the misinformation and sheer idiocy of the mainstream media's reporting about drugs.
So let's thank our patrons. We actually have some patrons, and I'm so grateful to them. It's really wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Right. We've got 2 subscribers already. Their names are David Wilder and Nicholas Debat.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. We only have 2 episodes so far of Drug Nonsense, but over time there's going to be
we'll be making
more
just for you guys.
Right.
And more subscribers to come.
And part of me feels a little bad that we put the Drug Nonsense behind the paywall, right? I mean, it's only $3 a month, but still, this is an important podcast, right? Every episode, for example, we have a call to action where we give you the phone numbers and emails of a media outlet that has reported on drugs in a dangerous way, a way that jeopardizes people's lives, a way that entrenches the drug war. And we know that the media responds to flack, right? So Drug Nonsense it's not just funny laughing at the media. It's also an activist podcast that allows you to take part and do something to help change the way drugs are presented in the media, which ultimately leads to cultural change in laws, and ending the drug war.
Right. Well, if there's a really important action item, we'll bring it up here. We'll share some of it, just for the sake of the movement. But I hope that people get on board and get on over there and get involved and become a subscriber, because we're going to be also releasing other fun stuff on there, various material that doesn't fit into the regular drug positive format, but it's extra.
Right. So go to patreon.com and search for Drug Positive. So I think we're just going to get right into the interview right now. It's a long one and it's an important topic. So here's my interview with David Nickles. David, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure. First thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you deal with the obvious confusion people have with your name and then Purdue University, David Nickles?
So I have been told certain folks have called me punk rock Dave Nickles. I have been called agitator Dave Nickles. The sort of funny thing is there's sort of an additional layer of confusion because the other Dave Nickles lives about 20 minutes away from me.
Oh, so. That's funny. How do you like the label agitator?
I would say my my intention is not necessarily to leave people agitated, but I think in the context of where we are, making noise or challenging certain systems that exist, components of dominant culture, kind of lead to that labeling. Whether I said things loudly and impassioned as I occasionally do, or if I was quieter and had a much less disruptive tone, I think I would still be called an agitator. So it's not the one that I would choose, but I understand why it gets applied.
Well, I've always been called an agitator, and I have a shirt, actually, I still have, from when I was an activist, even before I started Dance Safe. So we're talking like probably 1995 when I got this t-shirt, and I still have it. On the back, it says, educate, agitate, organize. And I take pride in that. So don't shy away from that label. It's a good one,
Totally.
So how did you get involved in the psychedelic community?
I got involved, I'll say, with psychedelics at 18. I had my first mushroom experience, and essentially it culminated in my first radical synthesis, where I had a whole bunch of understandings about capitalism, industrial civilization, ecocide, my own role in it. And it sort of stitched them all together in a really coherent and fascinating way that at the end of the experience, it pretty much left me in a position where I felt compelled to take action based on those newfound understandings. And for me, the other thing that was a super present component of the experience was this cathartic relief around confronting my own existential terror dealing with death. I mean, it really stuck with me. And ultimately, I knew that I was going to have these things as part and parcel of my life going forward.
That's really interesting because in one sense, you had a very classic psychedelic experience of confronting death, losing that fear. I mean, this is what Hefter Institute's doing with psilocybin, right? Terminal illness, et cetera. And that's more generalizable than the other experience you talked about, your anti-capitalist and ecocide views. Those may have come to you through your own filters.
Right. And frankly, it's part of the reason why I try to speak really carefully about these things, right? That psychedelics can facilitate experiences that may catalyze certain understandings or awarenesses about the world, about our places in it. Because for me, I can't step out of myself as much as I may like to imagine. At the end of the day, I have no way of saying there's something intrinsic or inherent to this experience that led to that. I can only say that the first time I took mushrooms, this is what it did to me.
Okay, fair enough. Well, do you have anything to say about the generalizable notion? There's studies that show that psychedelics make people more open, that they score higher on psychological tests on the scale of openness, which is heavily associated with liberalism, with what we would call the opposite of a conservative political perspective.
Totally. And one of the things that I kind of semi-joke about is like, if there's so much evidence that there's all this potential for openness and new connectivity and all these other things, then why does it seem like so many of the psychedelic institutions are suffering so much ossification? But at the same time, I think for me, the sort of simplest way to look at it is I would say, yes, psychedelics are inherently political. If we look through the literature from the last 50 or 60 years, you can find incredible numbers of anecdotal reports dealing with feelings of interconnection, of ecological integrity and the importance thereof, the notion that you are connected to not only all these other human beings, but to all life. The notion even that everything is love, or love is all you need, or love is the most important thing out there. To me, I would say that understanding is inherently political, because after your experience where you've maybe had some moments of unitive consciousness with the entire universe, and you come back feeling all loved up and you have the very strong belief that all there is love and love is the most important thing, well, suddenly you find yourself in a society that is literally spending trillions of dollars on advertising, trying to tell you that you're unlovable. I mean, how could it be anything other than political to be able to look at yourself and say, no, these things are already there?
Great. That's beautiful and correct. And I agree. So I guess I just have to come around. So where is your fear then that veterans are going to undergo MDMA therapy and go back out into the battlefield and kill people?
I think there's a couple of components at play there. I've encountered veterans who take psychedelics and have absolutely no qualms about killing people. So I think one of the things that's really important to understand about psychedelic therapy, as I understand it as a non-therapist, is that it's not just about the compound. It's also about the therapist, the type of therapy, what the approaches are. And so to me, it doesn't make any sense that the military would engage in therapeutic uses of psychedelics that would ultimately lead to desertion or pacifism.
Okay, hold on. Let's go back for a second. These were not vets with PTSD, though. These were active military personnel.
Not all of them. Probably the most chilling case was a guy who I met actually during Occupy, who I met him because he came up looking to be antagonistic and basically told me that the only thing that he found in his life that gave him joy was killing people.
What did he say about his MDMA experiences? Do you recall?
My recollection is that he was using it as a club drug, he enjoyed the music or whatever.
This doesn't sound like an individual with PTSD. I've interviewed over a dozen folks who went through the MAPS study, most of whom were veterans. And people who develop PTSD are people who have a conscience. PTSD is a moral crisis. PTSD results when the individual has interpreted their trauma in such a way that they blame themselves. And none of the vets I interviewed would ever go back and participate in war. In fact, a huge part of their PTSD has resulted from the knowledge that they went there and killed innocent people, that they weren't defending their country from terrorists like they were told, and they feel guilty. And one of the challenges for the VA, if they adopt MDMA therapy, is that their therapists are going to have to deal with that.
Right. To be honest, most of my critiques around MDMA for PTSD have dealt more with active duty questions than veterans, because to me, there's sort of these two tracks that are in existence simultaneously, right? What happens if these therapies are deployed? Not so much on the back end.
But wait. This is a hypothetical. Nobody's talking about using MDMA for active duty soldiers who are not veterans suffering from PTSD. What good would that do?
Rick Doblin has acknowledged that the military is engaged in secret MDMA studies. So
wait a minute. The military's interest in MDMA is solely in supporting veterans when they come home, particularly the VA not having to fork out whatever is like $1 million per veteran in lifelong meds. Are you trying to say that the military believes that somehow MDMA could make active duty soldiers into better killing machines?
So the thing that kind of alarms me about what you just said, right, is that you said the military's sole interest is. Now, personally, I'm not in the military.
Well, wait a minute. Let me clarify that, because I'm not suggesting that the military has never had interest in weaponizing or somehow utilizing psychedelics for nefarious purposes. I'm saying that right now, today, there's no, I don't know where you're coming from.
Rick says that MAPS and the MAPS folks found out about secret MDMA studies that were being conducted by the military because essentially some people reached out to MAPS to find out information, get help around their protocol.
They're doing studies for treating PTSD.
Perhaps the more relevant thing, given the angle that you seem to want to take this, is to raise the second question, which is, okay, so let's say that the military has no nefarious desires to use these things whatsoever. My question is still, what are the actual social and systemic effects when the military can turn to its populace and say, hey, we've found a technology that we can use to cure our soldiers of PTSD. So don't worry about any potential traumas. We can actually make them safe. We can make them whole. We can make them healthy when they return.
You're really suggesting that people are going to join the military who otherwise wouldn't because
now I asked the question of what it does for the broader populace. What does it do? How complacent does it make people more generally? When the military, when the government can say, look, we have potential cures for all the boys, don't worry about them. like, yes, I actually do worry about the degree to which that will defang some of the opposition to American imperialism.
Let me try to do some reflective listening and just tell me if this is correct. You're saying when the public learns that there is a cure for PTSD, that they will be more likely to support U.S. imperial military adventures? No. Okay, tell me again then. What I'm sorry. That's what I heard you say.
If you look through the history of military technologies, the way that this is always brought to the public is about how this will keep the troops safer. There's no commentary, there's no discussion on what these technologies are used for. Now it's, hey, we have MDMA. So look, you were really concerned about the traumas that your son might experience. But hey, we can allay those fears. We can put them to rest because don't worry, even if he gets super fucked up, when he comes home, we've got the magic pill.
I'm sorry. Sorry for laughing, but nobody wants their son or daughter to develop PTSD. And you can take MDMA and relieve yourself of the symptoms, but you are permanently changed having gone through that experience. And again, I have to repeat, every veteran that I've interviewed, their PTSD experiences was about the moral injury they suffered over there, largely because of realizing the wars were bullshit. They know that. They never want to go back and do it again. The ones who've gone through the therapy are much more open to tell people who say to them, thank you for your service, I was over there defending the corporations and killing innocent people.
Absolutely.
This is what MDMA therapy does. And the military is going to not be able to spin it any other way.
Really? I'm in touch with a number of psychedelic therapists, both above and underground. I'm in contact with people who are currently working with veterans using cannabis and ketamine. Now, those therapists have said to me that they have serious concerns around what the therapeutic models are that get employed within these practices, right? It depends what your actual protocols are. It depends what your interventions are. There are so many questions because we haven't seen this come to scale. And I think one of the things that I feel you're doing is misrepresenting me as making hard and fast assertions. When I'm asking questions, I'm raising these things as potential concerns given the landscape, given history, given the military's propensity to do things that make it more effective.
Hey, I'm with you. I just have enough experience with MDMA and seeing the impact that it has on people.
The veterans that you have had interaction with post-therapy have been guided through that therapy by therapists who have no skin in the game as far as a stake in the military.
I agree. The VA is going to have great challenges in providing MDMA therapy if they ever choose to do it, because they're going to have to deal with the moral injury issue, and that calls into question the whole justification for the wars.
Do you know who one of the significant investors in George Goldsmith's Compass Pathways company is? It's Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel gave a 2009 speech to the Cato Institute where not only did he decry women getting the vote, democracy, he also decried social safety nets, right? And so when you look at Peter Thiel's vision for society, Peter Thiel's vision for society literally drives the economic factors that ultimately feed the military machine.
Hey, so I'm with you. I'm totally with you. But I think MDMA is its own very powerful drug that has a very profound impact on people.
But you're now diverting from where we just were, right?
Oh, okay. What I'm suggesting is that, I know people who are becoming MDMA therapists.
Well, and who's criticizing MDMA therapy for veterans? I've asked some questions.
There is certainly, I read your recent article, The Dire Need for a Systemic Critique Within Psychedelic Communities, and there's a lot of rhetoric in there that at least comes across very critical of...
Can you tell me what specifically you're talking about?
Okay, here, second paragraph in the article. The broader psychedelic community has generated an increasingly commodified psychedelic landscape. Simultaneously, many biomedical psychedelic research efforts appear to utilize and/or support some of the most destructive aspects of dominant culture.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's very provocative. All right, what psychedelic research is supporting or utilizing the most destructive aspects of dominant culture?
So first and foremost, right, every psychedelic study that's being done through research institutions utilizes the FDA, right? FDA is located within the Department of Health and Human Services. DHHS is the same department that has facilitated immigrant detentions, that has facilitated child detentions, that has facilitated
so what you're saying is that they work with institutions that have pretty bad track records.
Right, and the DOD, right? So we see...
Okay, so that's a little different than saying utilize or support the most destructive aspects. I mean, let's be real. MAP's entire program is to help legalize these medicines. Re-legalizing MDMA, Rick realized had to happen through an FDA process. So what are you saying? He should never have done that?
MAPS has engaged with the Department of Defense, right? The Department of Defense, as I understand it, is, if not the world's biggest polluter, is one of the world's biggest polluters. And in addition to that, has been responsible for somewhere around a couple million dead since...
So you're talking to a lifelong anti-war activist here. You don't have to explain that to me.
What I'm trying to explain, right, is that when MAPS utilizes those systems, right,
when MAPS works with those institutions to try to legalize MDMA, go ahead.
Right. So let's imagine that MDMA is legalized, right? How many people will benefit from that? How many people?
Not enough. Not enough when it's legalized medically. We need to legalize it across the board, and medical legalization has always been considered just a first step.
But this is my point, right? The U.S. military is responsible for millions of deaths just since the start of the war on terror. Now, if we look back to like 1945, I've seen figures that suggest it's like 20 million or something like that. Now, that doesn't get into the number of people who are being traumatized. That doesn't get into the children who are in countries that we're not at war with.
Man, I share so much all your righteous anger on this, and I've worked against U.S. imperialism for my whole life since I was a teenager.
There's a kind of long arc here, and I'd like to be able to talk through it because you've asked me to.
Okay. All right, go ahead. I'll let you keep going.
So we also have issues. There's a number of countries that we're not at war with, where we're flying drone sorties overhead, right? There have been stories that have been shared about children who basically talk about praying for cloudy days because they believe that it means they're less visible to the drones.
Man, there's pictures of me at anti-drone protests on my Facebook page, right with you there. Keep going.
So imagining that we get MDMA legalized, let's start off with medically, right? And we say, great, now we can treat every single veteran who has PTSD. All of those populations abroad are still being killed and traumatized. We're talking about healing the veterans from our imperialist wars. And as individuals, each of those people has every single right to get any sort of medical treatment that will help them out. However, at the end of the day, even with getting those folks medical treatment, our military is still going to be engaged in actions that are killing and traumatizing people.
That's right. But don't you think now that all these veterans have been healed from their PTSD that they're going to be more likely to now speak out against the war? They're less traumatized. They have got more ability to reflect.
I'm 100% with that. I think whatever support we can give those folks in dismantling the military-industrial complex, I mean, they're intimately acquainted with it in ways that I'm not. You know, I'm
right.
happy to listen to them.
Yeah, Veterans for Peace is one of the more effective peace organizations out there.
I'm interested in Veterans for Peace. I'm also interested in Veterans for Insurrection, right? Like there's intersections between the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex, right? These systems rely on each other. When you have...
Okay. I think I understand your point better. So let me just ask you then, are you therefore critical of MAP's emphasis on veterans? Are you suggesting that maybe they should have not focused on healing veterans so much in their study and in their PR and instead focused more on PTSD for sexual abuse? Because 1 in 3 women are sexually abused in their lifetime.
I'm not making value judgments about whose traumas are more or less important than other people. I'm simply trying to point to some of the issues that I see with regards to MAPS's approach to veterans. And I think part of it, Rick has come out and said that part of this deals with optics, right? It's the same reason why he said that MAPS hired Saatchi & Saatchi, the same advertising firm that helped, Obama win the advertising award as the greatest product in 2008, in order to do focus groups focusing on religious conservatives, police groups, people who've been tough on crime. Like, the point of this is to create an optical environment that destigmatizes drugs in a certain way.
Yep.
The issue that I have with mainstreaming is that mainstreaming requires those of us who don't have values that are continuous with dominant culture to ultimately be forced to surrender some of those by, again, reaching out to some of these groups, right? Before we're reaching out to police groups to like make them okay with MDMA for their traumas, how about treating the victims of policing as a practice? Like,
okay, I think I get where you're coming from here, and let me give you the other argument, because having heard this, I still stand with Rick. I've operated under a set of political principles. I did this when I started Dance Safe too. Like, number one is speak to your allies first, because they're going to be the folks who agree with you. But then give your allies the ammunition, the resources to convert their adversaries. Because if we never reach out to our adversaries, if we never see them as potential allies, then we're never going to succeed.
Do you see Rebecca Mercer and or Peter Thiel as allies?
No, not in my broader political agenda, but I see them as becoming allies in the legalization of MDMA. And when we find common ground to work together on that, we're going to win even in our broader agenda, because MDMA is subversive. You know, Rebecca Mercer, if she takes MDMA in a therapeutic context, is only going to lessen her intolerance for blacks, gays, etc.
Again,
right?
Those are really, I mean, I don't make those types of hard and fast assertions because I don't think there's evidence for that.
I think there's a lot of evidence for that. In fact,
I'm pretty sure no scientific paper would ever write a conclusion that these things can only work that way.
The number one, hold on, the main personality trait that these substances tend to change is one that they call openness. Openness to new experience, openness to difference.
Tend to change. If you look at that study, right, it doesn't say 100% of participants.
Well, it's not 100%, but nobody shifts the other way. Either they don't change at all, or they tend to become more open and more accepting of others.
So again, I'm taking some issue with the degree of certainty that you're talking about a lot of this, right? When we hopped on the phone, you didn't even know that the military was engaged in secret MDMA studies.
No, I think you are framing that different than the way that I understand it. I'm aware of the military's interest in MDMA, but I don't think that it's what you're saying it is. I don't think they're trying to make better soldiers. I think
so. You believe, right? Like, that's an assertion that you're making without like evidence of that, right? Like,
well, yeah. I mean, if it's a secret program, how do any of us know what they're really doing? I guess I don't put it past them to be trying it again, but I think they're going to fail if they do try. I don't think MDMA can be used that way.
That's fine as an opinion, but it's not a factual assertion. This is the issue that I'm having with folks who are trying to pillory my position. I feel like I'm asking questions to allow for the possibility that based on the histories, based on the fact patterns we have seen.
Well, wait, let's say they're trying to weaponize it again, or they're trying to see if they can make better soldiers using MDMA. Like, do you think that first of all, do you think they're going to succeed in that? And second, the burden of proof is on you to provide evidence that they're doing that. I think it's much more likely that they're trying to cure PTSD.
I'm not making assertions. I'm asking questions. When I've spoken with therapists who are currently working with military veterans who have expressed a certain degree of concern over, well, gee, what might happen if you titrated the dose and played around with exposure therapies and try to see if there's some way to utilize that, right? Like, again,
let's talk about that. Okay, now you're bringing up something concrete. Tell me what you're talking about here.
To be clear, I'm not asserting that that's going to happen.
Well, I don't even know what that is. What do you mean titrating? Tell me what you're thinking. How can MDMA be utilized in a nefarious way?
I don't.
What possible?
I'm asked. Okay, so right now, there are drone operators who fly drone sorties during the day, and then they go home, right, to their regular suburban lives and live out their days, whatever.
Yeah.
Those folks are having increased levels of PTSD, right? This has been observed.
And you think that maybe they could be given MDMA therapy and then go back and do their jobs better, going around killing even more children?
I think that to say that unequivocally that can't happen and that won't happen is inappropriate. I think that, again,
well, I'm telling you,
to make that as an assertion of certainty, I mean, seriously, like how many things in this world are absolutely certain?
So, nothing's certain, right? But it sounds like you're clinging to a fear. And all I'm suggesting is I think that that's unwarranted. I think it's hard for me to believe that someone would go back and continue to kill people after healing from their trauma.
What happens, right? What happens when the military frees up its budget and is able to spend that on other things? What happens when Rebecca Mercer's other policies go into effect? What happens when we all bear the consequences of the ecological disasters that continue to unfold as a result of those policies? What happens when we see increased drivers of military enlistment due to all of those other positions, right? Like the MDMA is a tiny, tiny portion of what these folks are doing. And for you to
yeah, that's why I'm always been an activist on other causes too. But I can say, given especially the environmental destruction that's going on and the lack of progress we've made on these other issues, it's more fun working in drug policy reform because at least we're having some results. And I have a bit more hope that MDMA's legalization, not just medically again, but I see it as a first step for across-the-board legalization, will have a much greater positive impact on all these other issues that we're talking about.
That's a nice belief. That's a nice assumption. But where's the evidence?
Well, the evidence for me are all the people I've talked to throughout my life, people I've given MDMA to, and I've seen the positive impact it's had.
Burning Man is literally, we might call that the nexus of, drug experiences and transformative culture or whatever we want to call that, right?
Yeah, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about MDMA. I'm talking about MDMA and healing trauma. And what MDMA did for me when I was 16 years old and first took it, and I was a runaway and from an abusive home.
I'm assuming you're going to throw this right back in my face. I don't get effects from MDMA.
Oh, that's very interesting. That I was going to ask you that, that explains a lot because
I get effects from MDA. I get effects from mescaline. I do not. I have taken up to 250, 275 milligrams of incredibly pure material and have had no effects beyond a slight increase in my own temperature, warmth.
No wonder. That explains everything. You haven't experienced it, and you're not alone. You're probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population.
I was a little hesitant to put this out there because you don't get to tell me that my systemic critiques are no longer valid because I haven't had the experience.
No. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you don't have the experience to understand how transformational MDMA is for people who are able to experience it.
Sure. And I'm not speaking to that, right?
But we have to, I mean, to me, that's the basis of this entire discussion. Do you know Richard Rockefeller's vision? Richard Rockefeller donated a lot to MAPS, and he was going to fund my film. I talked to him just 2 weeks before he died tragically in a Cessna accident about 4 years ago. His vision, he was a board member for Doctors Without Borders, and his vision was getting MDMA therapy to war-torn nations across the planet, including, tribes in Africa who for decades have been fighting each other and everybody on both sides are traumatized. He really believed in the ability of MDMA to end war.
So here's the question, right? So now let's imagine you've dosed the entire continent of Africa, right? Everybody's had the MDMA experiences. Now, certainly you're not going to pretend to tell me that all of the corporations that can trace their resource extraction back to colonialism are suddenly going to stop generating material conditions that make day-to-day life a living hell in numerous places on the continent, are you?
No, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm actually very, very cynical about the ability of human civilization to survive, and I'm pretty cynical about...
This is where my systemic critique comes back into play. Because the notion that you can give people these compounds and not change the material conditions in which they find themselves, again, like the notions that some of these...
we definitely have to do both. Absolutely, we have to do both.
That's what I'm saying, right? So when you've got folks like Ben Sessa who are saying 2 doses and they're cured, I'm sorry, giving the working poor 2 doses of psilocybin is not going to put an end to their depression, full stop. Unless we actually dig in, engage with these material conditions, I mean, this is the main.
This is a really important point when it comes to intersectional trauma you're talking about here. But here, I've thought a lot about this, and there's some really good, really radical people within MAPS, Natalie, for example, who understand this. When you take MDMA and have some realizations about your intersectional trauma, how the dominant white culture has put you down and made you feel inferior, and all of the looks you get on the bus and the comments you get from store clerks and all of this racism that you experience, and you've internalized that and have this shame, right? Because PTSD is an identity, a moral identity disorder. And so to the degree that MDMA can help with that, it's to the degree that it has this magical ability, which unfortunately you don't feel, of giving the person a sense of self-love. And when you've hated yourself, when you don't like yourself, like I hated myself as a kid because of what my father did and said to me, and you have this experience, you can heal. You can heal from that. Now, for me, as a privileged white male in society, I took that and became self-actualized and ran with it, and I've started nonprofits and done all this with my world, right? But if you're black, you still have to confront that racism every day. But that's still a much better place to be. You can then develop a righteous anger. You can then organize with other people against racism. If you're still suffering the shame, if you're still internalizing that dominant culture's view of yourself, you're never going to be able to fight back.
Then there's also questions about access around all that, right? So like here right. You are making all these statements as though like, again, people who are in material circumstances where they're working multiple jobs to take care of their family and maybe...
Absolutely. Big important topic, access. This is why I say the first episode of this podcast and every time I talk that medical legalization is not enough. We need MDMA available freely for anyone who wants to take it in whatever context, because people have these experiences of self-acceptance and therapeutic healing everywhere they take it. They don't have to go to a clinic to do it.
If we don't address these situations, if we don't address these material realities, and the people that move into this space are the people that are moving into this space, are the Peter Thiels and Shlomi Razes of the world, right? The notion that somehow access is going to magically be afforded, to me, the assertion doesn't hold. And that's the reason why I'm trying to call attention to questions around those material conditions rather than starting with the substance.
Yeah. So you weren't privy to the early discussions within MAPS and the psychedelic community about the strategy. Rick has always understood that medical legalization is just a first step, and that really he focused on MDMA because it had the most profound and successful ability to treat a disorder that was an epidemic and very debilitating. That's why Rick focused on MDMA as opposed to the therapeutic value of other psychedelics. Once a drug gets legalized medically, it softens public opinion. Once public opinion softens, we can then get state-by-state initiatives for decriminalization, ultimately leads to the legal regulation. Just like happened with cannabis, medical cannabis.
Are you familiar that in California, some of the counties utilize different ordinances in order, so I know I think it's Sonoma County, if you have less than 10 acres, you can't grow outside, right? Like they've passed a whole bunch of laws across the terrain that
well, I'm in the cannabis growing county, and they're doing the same thing here. Yeah, I understand the struggles and the battles that are happening right now.
Well, hang on. So my assertion then is that nice, pretty picture of, we get medical, and then we get, then we get wholesale, and then everybody can engage in it. It hasn't even held true with a plant.
Oh, there's a lot of work that needs to happen, but the difference between today and, even just 10 years ago is astounding.
Right, and the difference between today and 150 years ago, we're in a complete, you could argue it was more free 150 years ago.
Oh, progress is being made. And, so let me ask you, if you don't agree with the strategy of changing cultural perception, softening public opinion, and trying to lead towards laws that decriminalize these drugs, what do you suggest we do?
It's not that I'm against that. I have questions about how that's being done. When these approaches are emphasizing reaching out to people who make many of us fundamentally unsafe, this isn't abstract for many of us. This isn't some, not all of us have Rick's privilege and get to think about the police as people who keep him nice and safe.
So
have
let me give one other example I give to a lot of people around political strategy. the same advertising corporations that defended the cigarette companies against claims that cigarettes were carcinogenic then went on to defend the oil companies and are largely responsible for spreading the lie that global warming is not caused by humans, right? And it was a member of the Heartland Institute. You must know about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said in this documentary, the best thing that ever happened to our cause of sowing mistrust over science, is when Al Gore released his documentary. Because when Al Gore released his documentary, Inconvenient Truth, we could immediately present this as a partisan issue and get all the Republicans to be against it.
Totally.
So what I want to suggest to you is that Rick's strategy is correct. The worst thing to happen to the cause for MDMA legalization or drug legalization in general, right? Because we got an opiate crisis, we got a fentanyl crisis going on there, is if it becomes a Democratic issue. If we don't reach out to Republicans, if we don't bring the conservatives on board.
If Rick thinks that reaching out to Republicans and all that is so important, I think that there's much more important work to do around underserved and incarcerated populations. To me, my priority personally, as somebody who has no say in this whatsoever, is not about making the Mercers and other folks feel comfortable with this. And, again, if the response to that is that I'm putting myself outside of the conversation by taking that position, fine. I'm an anti-capitalist in the here and now. When people try to tell me that I'm being idealistic or unreasonable, I guess I just don't know any other way to be.
I admire your passion. I really do. I wonder. Let me just say one other thing. My father passed away, and my father was a malignant narcissist. But nonetheless, I learned to forgive him through my MDMA experiences when I was a teenager. And I struck up a relationship with him again, though I never moved back in with him. I kept my distance. I was able, military veterans, to realize, I'm healing. I like myself. I'm better now. I'm not on a self-destructive path of self-hatred anymore. But I'm going to protect myself, and I'm not going to risk that again. But over the years, I thought about why my dad was like how he was. He was a hardcore conservative. He listened to Rush Limbaugh. And I believe that my MDMA experiences led me to try to understand why my father was like he was. And I eventually convinced my father to take MDMA with me. I'd already started Dance Safe at this point, and I wanted to confront him with some horrifying things he had done to my mother. I had already forgiven him for what he had done to me, but I wanted to confront him and let him know that I forgave him even for that, because I know somewhere inside of him there must have been a place where he felt a little guilty about it. Well, he ends up breaking down in tears on the MDMA and telling me the story of his own childhood trauma.
Sure.
And I don't think he'd ever told anyone that story in his life. But being on the MDMA, and for whatever reason, he was able to tell me about this. And I believe wholeheartedly that my father's personality was shaped largely as a result of unresolved trauma.
Sure.
And that if I never reached out to him, if I never was willing to look at my perceived adversary as a potential ally, he never would have had the...
Okay, this is again where the systemic critique issue comes in, right? Because when it is not individuals who are deciding to take us to war, when it is not individuals who are deciding to engage in ecocidal actions, right? When it is essentially unaccountable tyrannies, right? Corporations, that doesn't mean anything. If you dose the whole board and you dose the CEO and you dose the CFO, there are systemic components in place that will wipe them out and that will bring in people who are willing to do the stuff that will maximize profit.
Oh, you're so pessimistic. Possibly. I'm not saying we don't have to fight on the systemic side too, but I think that the more people we convert, I'm
not arguing that having more people familiar with psychedelic experiences is bad. What I am saying is, okay, so imagine Apple, right? You dose the CEO, right? Or even you show the CEO all of the terrible things that are going on. CEO comes to the board and says, oh my God, there's all these terrible things going on. The board laughs and gets a new CEO. Similarly, right, if the board doesn't engage in profit maximization, the shareholders laugh and get rid of the board. So, like, the notion that...
Yeah, right. We've got big systemic problems, man. I'm not saying MDMA is going to immediately solve all of them.
What I'm saying is I think that Rick and others have put the cart before the horse. And I'm not saying that one has to come before the other. But what I am saying is that from my perspective, it appears as though there is little to no systemic engagement alongside with the strategy of, gee, we get these things legal and good things happen.
Well, I think you're wrong about that. First of all, there's a lot of people in MAPS who are working on the systemic side who are looking into like intersectional trauma and how psychedelics can interface with that. Virtually everyone in MAPS is liberal.
That's not what I'm saying, right? Again, the fixation is on the treatment of the individual. And I'm not suggesting...
But wait a minute, but MAPS is not a anti-capitalist organization. They're an organization with a mission to legalize psychedelics. And
I'm not even saying MAPS should be an anti-capitalist organization. What I am saying is that MAPS's approach doesn't address these things. That's why I'm trying to ask these large, difficult questions that don't necessarily have clear answers. This is why I've come at this from trying to stimulate discussion around it rather than saying, no, you're wrong, I have answers. I've been asking questions about this. I've been saying, here are potential problems I see. What do you all think about this?
Well, that's great. I can tell you what I think. I think that MAPS is in many ways single-mindedly focused on the medical legalization of MDMA, and that I support that, and I think that's a very important first step towards ending the drug war in general. And the drug war is a source of such terrible suffering around the world. And I believe in the strategy. I think it's a correct strategy. And I also have the systemic critique that you have. I just don't see a conflict between the two the way that you do.
I would contend it's not that I see like you seem intent on making this like a polarized issue. Right? Like what I'm...
That's the last thing I want to do, because I thought I would do this interview with you to try to make things less polarized, because it seemed to be polarized before I ever even spoke to you.
What I'm trying to make is room for these questions, right? And yet, as we've spoken, you have stated unequivocally beliefs as facts. You have stated that some of these things only work in this way, or some of these things are guaranteed to have these effects. And I just don't see it. And like, frankly, like you're right, I don't get effects from MDMA. But I've certainly had plenty of lessons about loving myself, accepting myself, being part of functional systems, ecological and social, from mushrooms, from DMT, from ayahuasca, from mescaline, again, like it's not like, oh, I haven't gotten off on MDMA, so like I'm incapable of understanding these states of ecstatic connection or ontological destruction or, fill in the blank, right? Like it's not like I'm psychedelically naive, but many of the therapists that are going to be entering into these spaces are. And in my experience, not everybody has an affinity for psychedelics. And so the notion that, oh, wait, Compass or whoever is going to dose a bunch of psychedelically naive therapists and suddenly they will not only, be good therapists and have, some real understanding, they'll really get it and be able to work with these things in productive ways. We don't know.
I guess, I two things to say to that. Number one is I think there's already millions of people who are psychedelically naive having new psychedelic experiences all the time, and millions of people who are giving psychedelics to their friends. So the fact that a very small percentage of them are now going to start happening in a medical context isn't going to change the big picture. People are already doing psychedelics and they're already having these experiences, right?
I'm not arguing against that. You missed the very special context in which I was talking.
Okay, so there's going to be challenges, the other thing I was going to say, in making sure that the professional medical contexts in which psychedelics are given in therapeutic clinics, there's going to be challenges to make sure that happens in appropriate ways. And
the rush. Why does this need to happen right here, right now, when this is never going to affect positively the entire populace? Like, why is there a rush to suddenly...
No, it is. I'm telling you, the closer we come to ending the drug war, it's going to have major repercussions on all the systemic issues we're talking about, because the drug war is so central to everything. The militarization of the police, the no-knock raids with battering rams, the prison industrial complex, all this is related to the drug war.
There's so much money in that. You really think that's going to go away? Again, this is why I pointed to the issues with cannabis.
Hey, well, wait a minute. If you don't think it's ever going to go away, then I don't know what kind of conversation we're having, because we need to talk about how to make it go away. This is about strategy, and I'm telling you, I think that the strategy of MDMA legalization is a very good one.
The question I'm asking is, looking at what's going on with cannabis and the fact that they have figured out strategic ways to keep interdiction rolling.
We ain't seen nothing yet. It's just beginning. The cannabis legalization drive. Like, you wait. I like to tell people cannabis should be free, because there's no other agricultural crop that produces more per acre than cannabis, right? It should be cheaper than tomatoes. And the only reason that it's not is because of prohibition. And I tell this to my growing friends, because I live in a growing county out here, and they actually opposed, the growers out here opposed recreational legalization because they were worried that the price was going to drop. And I'm like, the price should drop. You should be out of business. I'm sorry. Nobody should pay a dime for cannabis. And you watch, we're going to get to that point. It's already coming.
Those people wind up out of business. Corporations suddenly have,
anyone can grow plants in their backyard. You'll have idiots buying cheap macro beer everywhere, but you're going to have the micro brew option available everywhere too. We're not going to stop. It's like you're always looking at the negative, Yeah, fuck Anheuser-Busch.
Put it as the negative, yes, there are detrimental effects, but my point is not that, let's look at the negative. My point is people are living with this shit. My point is that, this isn't abstract for many people. And the way that this gets talked about, I mean, fuck, man, you're literally talking about people's livelihoods. You just said in the most blasé manner possible, they shouldn't have those livelihoods. The thing that you just threw out there has real fucking consequences for those people.
The only reason anyone can make a living growing cannabis today is because Black people are rotting in jail for smoking it. Period. Cannabis should be legal. If you can grow one cannabis plant and feed your whole family for an entire year, nobody should be able to make a living on it.
Sure, but nobody should be required to make a living at wage slavery anyway. So if we take your line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, again, we wind up at the massive systemic problems that undergird all of this.
I lost you there. I'm just talking about how ending cannabis prohibition is going to free the plant up and let everyone grow it wherever they want. It sounds like you're on a mission to get people to wake up to the systemic issues. And I agree with that. I've spent a lot of my time doing the same thing. Maybe I just have a little more hope in a single issue, like let's end the drug war in any way that we can, and then maybe that'll make these other things more possible.
So for me, I have not seen the evidence from the major proponents of that strategy. And for me, okay, so maybe I'm more pessimistic than you, and I'll paraphrase Kafka and say, there is hope, but not for us. If we look systemically, if we look at the science that has been published, we are at or over the precipice. Climate change is happening faster than any of the models have predicted.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so for me, it's not that I'm wholesale opposed to medicalization. It's that I think a medicalization foundation fundamentally structures what you can put on top of that foundation. And I don't think that there has been real in-depth, hard critical thought around the structures and systems that are all coming into play on those things. There are still huge questions about the trajectory for psychedelics, MDMA and otherwise, to whatever extent we even want to call MDMA a psychedelic.
Hey, have you read the theories why some people can't experience MDMA?
I don't believe so.
There's a number of different ones. Are you curious about this?
Absolutely.
So the first one is...
If I could, have somebody analyze something and give me some sense.
Yeah. So the first one is oxytocin receptor genetic profiles. We all have differing abilities to release and receive the hormone oxytocin, which is, of course, responsible for the bonding between infant and child, empathy, and love, really. The loving feelings that we get from our partner and from our child, the willingness to engage in altruistic actions as a result of that feeling, scientists believe is largely correlated with oxytocin. And so maybe you ask yourself, wow, have you maybe you're not the romantic kind of guy. Maybe you...
no, quite the opposite.
So that's one theory. The other thing, like, what's the highest dose you've tried?
Of MDMA?
Yeah.
Like 250, 275 milligrams at once.
And you still felt nothing?
That's what tickled the warmth sensation where
Yeah, okay, so you also might want to get a 23andMe genetic profile because you also could be an ultra-fast metabolizer of the cytochrome P450 known as the CYP2D6 liver enzyme. Although most of the people, and there's a big range, right? So I've talked to other people who are ultra-fast metabolizers who have said they need to take at least 250 milligrams in order to feel MDMA at all. You might just be on the high end of the ultra-fast metabolizer range. And if you went up to 400 maybe even, again, I would get a test to find that out first because...
Right. I was going to say, those are not really waters that I'm super...
400s are up there. A normal person, but if it's true, then that might give you a real experience.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Then there's other, but I don't think this is you. There's other theories about, why narcissists or psychopaths can't experience empathy at all because they don't have the anatomical structures in their brain,
right,
wherever it is, to experience it. And so, even though they may have serotonin release, they're just not going to get out of MDMA what most people do. So those are the three theories that I've heard. And I've definitely confirmed the second one, right? The metabolizing issue.
Sure. And like I said, I find it super fascinating that I'm still able to get effects and considerable effects from MDA and mescaline, both of which I have quite an affinity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's curious. That might negate that theory about you. Tell me, how do you respond to Vicodin?
I wouldn't know.
Oh, okay. Because so there some opiates like hydrocodone are also metabolized through the same cytochrome P450. So if you don't feel Vicodin, then that might be another confirmation that you're an ultra-fast metabolizer.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't get real strong effects when I was using it post-surgery. I did have an extended withdrawal that the doctor said I should not have experienced, and yet, I experienced it. I don't know what my experience was. So.
Well, listen, let's close this up. It's been fascinating talking to you. Well, what's your summarizing statement? We've had some disagreements here. I think it's, for the most part, been very cordial and respectful. What would you think? How would you summarize where do we agree? Where do we disagree?
I mean, I think it sounds like we agree on the potential for personally transformative experiences through the use of psychedelic substances. Is that accurate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think
we agree on more than that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think we also agree that systemically, things are pretty wrecked. I think we agree that looking at problems of U.S. militarism and imperialism, we see a pretty horrific picture, and that needs to be addressed, right? There's no question.
Yep.
I think the part where we start to diverge, it's these questions around, do psychedelics inherently catalyze radical perspectives in people? I don't necessarily think that there is a pharmacological guarantee that X substance has Y effect and that can be counted on in such a way that they'll ultimately wind up at these understandings. I think many people have understandings that align with that and in many ways aren't able to act on them because of the systemic nature of their position. Because how does one break out of structural poverty?
Yeah, I know, but I definitely agree with you. Let's hope that psychedelic therapists doing work with intersectional trauma have an understanding of racism and politics and intersectional trauma, right? Let's hope that's the case.
But here's where I think we sort of differ, right? When you say you hope that that's the case, of course, I also hope that that's the case. But I think it goes so far beyond just the therapist, right? I think it goes beyond...
Hey, let's get these drugs available to the African-American community out there. Let's let them use it on their own. That's what I say. Just stop fucking persecuting them and make these things available, and they will develop their own therapeutic groups, and they will become activists, and they will fight back against the systemic oppression that's happening. And legalization is a big way that's going to happen. And, a lot of people believe one of the reasons these drugs remain illegal is because their potential to radically transform people and communities and free their minds is too threatening.
Right. And Rick has stated both explicitly and implicitly that there needs to be some cleansing of those components. Right? Like that's how you get to work with police. That's how you get folks like the Mercers on board. That's how you get the excited tech bros of Silicon Valley in there. By presenting these things not as radical catalysts, but as, in the case of LSD, as uber nootropics for your coders, right? Now they can code apps with such creativity. Oh my God, you never would have expected it. And look at all the revenue that flows in as a result of that. So this is where we diverge, I think, because when I hear mainstreaming, what I understand is that principle right there, that sort of respectability politics, that sort of notion of, oh, don't worry, these things really aren't as much of a threat to the established order as y'all believe. And to me, that cuts so far against the grain. That has, to my mind, a pretty significant chilling effect around how these things are understood. Because if these things are understood in a cultural container where they support, where they reinforce, where they enrich aspects of dominant culture and are utilized and taught and shared as such, I think what we stand to lose is the true subversive potential and understanding of these compounds.
That's very interesting. I think that's the most articulate way you've expressed your concerns in this entire interview.
Sorry, sometimes it takes me a while to get warmed up.
Yeah, that puts it in a nutshell really clearly. What I think is that, for the most part, reaching out to the other side, if you will, is a strategic plan in order to get these things legalized. And that those of us who are doing that and who believe in that strategy may have more faith that the outcome of legalization will end up being more powerful than any of the sort of minor cultural changes in public perception of psychedelics as non-subversive, right? I think they are subversive.
Here's the question. What's the difference between that perspective and get it in the water supply?
First of all, psychedelics have to be situated within a cultural context. So I'm agreeing with you around that. There has to be a cultural context from which to interpret these experiences. It's just like meditation. I think the same is true with meditation. So I agree. The cultural context is important in defining the outcome.
You're perfect. Look at what happened, right? Yoga hit dominant culture. And now you get Lululemon, right? Now you get the commodification of all of these components, right? Of yoga.
Oh my God, do not get me started. Yoga actually has nothing to do with stretching. That was called hatha in ancient India. Yoga were practices of meditation to liberate, to yoke, right? Yourself with Brahman. And so I agree with you.
So psychedelic. Right? So this notion that somehow, if we mainstream this, if we take out the most subversive and scary and antagonistic components as far as dominant culture is concerned, then we can, sort of swing this into place. This is what I'm concerned when I talk about foundations, when I talk about medicalization and really mainstreaming more than medicalization, but mainstreaming or medicalization is a part of mainstreaming. Like, this is my concern about
Have you listened to any of my other podcast episodes?
I have not.
You should listen to them because you're going to find so many points of agreement between us.
Look, I hold down a radical critique and praxis, not because I think everyone's going to join me, but because Rick has been on the record stating that MAPS is on the conservative end of the legalization movement. And like, for me, if I have to hold down a position, a radical praxis and critique in order to make sure that we have a fairly balanced middle in this space, that's something that to me has its own merits, because I've had conversations with numerous people, some of them very prominent, about these issues. And to me, the thing that's always bothered me about those conversations is that they're happening on the margins. And to my mind, these are some of the most important conversations that are happening in and about these spaces. And so for me, the reason that I even considered getting up on stage at any point in my history, it was that when I went to those places to share phytochemical and harm reduction work, I saw that there were so many clowns and jokers and entertainers that were getting on stage that were providing stuff that, to my mind, was unacceptable. There was no engagement with new themes for the last decades. And so for me, seeing all of these important and difficult and sometimes impossible questions being asked and wrestled with on the margins, it was like, wait a minute, why isn't this happening front and center on stage? And I understand that for some people, it's not comfortable. I understand that some people would like to not consider these political questions because there are no easy answers, and that's tough. But for me, like, if we're not willing to shine a light on that and grapple with that, then what's the point of all this?
You know, when I was sitting around the Zendo camp at Burning Man when you were the topic of conversation, in the end, the conclusion was, even though people disagreed with you, he's bringing up good questions that we need to talk about more. So like, everyone's on the same page. You know, I think our disagreements are about strategy. I have greater hope that medical legalization will be a domino that leads us closer to ending the drug war. And so I'm willing to support a strategy that gets the law passed. And that means reaching out to conservatives and getting them on board. And if it means framing it in a way that's less radical to get the legislation passed, I'm willing to do that. It's something, though, I should say, that's been difficult for me at other times. Let me give you an example. This was back in the mid-'90s when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the 3 strikes laws were on the ballot. This was our beloved Bill Clinton, right, was president. And,
yep.
And the coalition that I was working with to oppose the 3 strikes laws did an opinion poll, right? And what they did is they put out some different advertising copy to random large numbers of people to see the response. And in one version, they said that 3 strikes laws will disproportionately affect people of color, youth of color. And in the other one, they didn't mention the race issue at all. And what they found was that when they mentioned the race issue, far fewer people were willing to oppose it. When it didn't mention the race issue, way more people were willing to oppose the 3 strikes laws. And it was like such a testament to the racism in our culture. And they were saying, we got to follow what the data says. We got to make our campaign and not mention that it disproportionately is going to affect youth of color. And I couldn't deal with it. And I left. I said, I can't do that. I have to speak the truth, you know? So I'm with you. I get the compromises. Everyone's got to draw their line somewhere, you know, the compromises we're willing to make in our own advocacy, for example, you know, but I don't know if is it age? Is it wisdom? Is it that I'm exasperated and I'm willing to try anything because I've been fighting this fight for so long? But, you know, seeing the success that MAPS has had in getting even the right wingers to come on board, to me, is heartening. It's not disheartening.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm kind of sympathetic to that. And the reason is that, like, I see how I've mellowed myself over the past decade, right? Like, I can go find posts and critiques and analysis for myself a decade ago that I would say it's not wrong. I don't necessarily disagree with the ideologies being presented, but the manner was definitely a hell of a lot more abrasive and a lot more firebrandy even than I would say I am now.
Man.
I can understand, you know, I mean, hell, like, I've felt my own capacity and capabilities shift, and I like to say I'm learning, have been working on learning that, you know, you get more flies with honey than vinegar or whatever. With that said, when we're talking about the participation and existence of certain folks in some of these spaces, such as the Mercers and Peel and others, like, I think it, and I can't, and maybe I'm just echoing your own sentiments around the 3 strikes laws, which is that I can't abide that at this point in my life, right here, right now, with how psychedelics have informed and shaped some of my own perspectives and experiences. And so part of the reason why I've been so vocal about Compass is because, to me, it represents sort of the logical conclusion of mainstream, which is that all of the subversive elements have been stripped out. All of the reinforcing components with regards to dominant culture are alive and well and prepared to make big bucks off of this space. And that, to me, it scares me. It makes me not only scared, but also, like, sad, like in almost a defeated way, right? Like, sad when I think about my own experiences and I think about how intrinsic they were and really are to my being right here, right now, the person that I am today, like the notion that could be so thoroughly recontextualized that maybe that won't be a thing for other people. I mean, and hopefully the underground will be alive and well, and that.
Well, that's what I was just going to tell you. It's always going to be alive and well.
I guess my vision for the world is something where those underground values are propagated far and wide, and that mainstreaming happens at a point where those values have been propagated and are capable of subverting the mainstream. Not mainstreaming where the compounds have been mainstreamed, and in doing so, we've lost all that subversive potential.
And I think Rick would agree with you about that. He has said about the criticism around the Mercer donation verbatim to me. What do people think? That the Mercers are going to influence me? Or that I'm going to influence the Mercers, right? And I think the same thing holds. We get these drugs legalized. What do we think that just because we use a little bit of conservative rhetoric to get the Republicans on board to legalizing it, that then suddenly all the MDMA therapists out there and the whole world's going to start to see these drugs differently than the way the community really does? I mean, have you been to a MAPS conference? Have you been to the Psychedelic Science?
I presented at Psychedelic Science 2013.
Oh, okay, great. So you must know, like, okay, you got all your professional data, boring, no offense, boring, whatever. And then at night, everyone trips and it's an underground scene. Everybody involved, they understand what these drugs really do in the community context in which people use them.
I'll have you know, I gave one of those boring data talk. Although in that context, it was likely significantly more actionable than most people's, as it dealt specifically with plants used in ayahuasca and other preparations and what have you.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on. I have to say, this has been a fascinating and interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.